Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to this Journey 4 webinar on the subject of work-life balance. My name is Stuart Pearce, and before I introduce our host, Jonathan Booth, this morning, I just want to run through a few housekeeping matters. The session will be recorded, and a link to the recording will be circulated to all attendees after the event. A copy of the presentation slides that our speakers will be using this morning will be made available to everyone after the event too. Can I just draw your attention to the Q&A button on the screen? We do have a Q&A session at the end after the presentations, so please leave your questions on the Q&A function and we'll put them up later. And also, can I just draw your attention to the chat function as well, should you want to leave any queries or make some comments during the presentations, during the webinar, then please leave them on the chat. So without any further ado, I'd like to introduce Jonathan Booth, who is our host this morning. Jonathan is a director of Journey 4. He's an expert in customer-driven growth and transformation. So over to you, Jonathan.
Thanks, Stuart, and good morning, everybody. And welcome to the third in what is a series of 4 webinars on smarter working. The Smarter Working is an initiative that Journey 4 started back in the spring of 2020 in response to the initial lockdown of COVID. And we started to talk to a lot of businesses across many sectors, over 20 businesses across 10 different sectors, around what was the changes they were having to respond to during lockdown, and particularly how those things might change post-lockdown, and obviously post-COVID, whenever that might be, hopefully sometime this year. So over the time, we've been talking to businesses and capturing information which is available on our website around the adaptations businesses made and the learnings that are good and bad in terms of that period. And this webinar focuses on specifically elements of work-life balance that have been impacted during the period and that can hopefully be learnings we can take into the future. The first 2 webinars were on leadership and on productivity, and the 4th one next month will be on communication. So for today's focus on work-life balance, we have 3 speakers. I'm delighted to welcome and introduce Sue Evans, David Evans, no relation, and Craig Speed. So thank you to the 3 of you for taking part. Each of our speakers is going to talk for 10 minutes, and as Stuart mentioned, there's a Q&A facility, so please do pop any questions you've got on the Q&A facility as they're speaking, and at the end of the session we'll leave 10 minutes left for us to have a panel discussion around those Q&As. So without further ado, we'll get going with our first speaker, who is Sue Evans. Sue's from Fast Pathways, and Sue has a background in change and transformation generally, particularly lean transformation, but over the last has focused a lot. We're getting an echo. Anybody hear me? Okay? I'll carry on. Over the last 10, Sue has been on well-being, both well-being and how to improve well-being. She's going to talk about making well-being. So thanks. Mark, over to you.
Yeah, we have got a weird thing going on sound there. I'm hoping mine's okay.
Yours is
wonderful. If anyone who starts waving frantically, that means you can't hear me anymore. So yeah, 10 minutes to explore making well-being work. Let's start with the context of that. Why does well-being matter? Well, obviously it's the right thing to do, but it's actually quite good for the business bottom line as well. There was a big study done by Deloitte, which was updated about June last year, that found that the average return on investment in well-being is £5.20 for every pound invested. Now, particularly in challenging economic times, I think a 5-fold return on investment is really quite attractive. Another reason why it's getting increasingly important is a Big Mind survey found that even during first lockdown, over half of adults said that their mental well-being had worsened. I dread to think what's going to happen now that we're in second lockdown. So if ever you were considering putting a wellbeing initiative in place, now is a great time. There's a lot of talk about what well-being is and isn't, and it isn't just about avoiding mental ill health. That's part of it, but there's so much more to it. Our well-being is our state of mind. It's how we're feeling day to day and how we show up and how we perform. And there is a big gap in a lot of programs provision. We're very, very good at concentrating on reducing the stigma of mental health. There's been huge investments in mental health awareness training and first aid. Lots of organisations are supporting EAP, provision of counselling, all those kind of things. Very important, but they only take effect once a problem's actually developed. They're all focusing on helping somebody to recover more effectively rather than not to need to recover in the first place. It's the equivalent of sending in our people to do loads of heavy lifting with no manual handling training, but making sure that they can get really good physio once they're hurt. Prevention is just as important around mental health as it is around physical. Now, I've got a particular take on well-being. My take on it is that it's all to do with maintaining a balance between the total load that we're experiencing, and that's made up of our worries, upsets, anxieties, frustrations, those things that kind of get under your skin and bother you, compared to the resources that we have for dealing with it. So a lot of those loads are ones that we'd rather not experience, but as long as we do have the resources, either within ourselves or within our support network, we still maintain that balance, we still stay well. When that balance starts to slip, as well as being uncomfortable and possibly quite distressing for the individual, there's also loads of different ways that that affects the organisation as well. I do apologise, hang on. There we go, sorry about that. So one of the effects is our decision making, because making decisions requires resources. So if we feel that they're already being stretched, we're more likely to put off important decisions or to just go with whatever's easiest and get it off our plate. And neither of those are likely to be good decisions within the business context. Another very common effect is when we're distracted by something that's bothering or upsetting us, it's harder to stay focused on a particularly complicated task. We're more likely to make mistakes. Now, some of those mistakes could be really simple. You know, perhaps you've misentered some data on a spreadsheet and you've got to sift back through and find it. Yeah, they take a bit of time to correct. But some of those mistakes could have implication on your compliance or your customer experience or your safety performance. Another common effect, when we're experiencing any kind of heightened alert, we go into that kind of fight-flight state, which was great when we needed to survive predators and not that relevant when it's a difficult colleague or a looming deadline. But that heightened state puts us into survival mode, which switches off our more creative thinking. So our problem solving suffers. And there are so many times over the years that I've been working with people who've been experiencing a particularly big, complicated load that they thought there was absolutely nothing they could do about, until with a few straightforward skills for taking the mind off that high alert, the creative thinking reconnects, and all of a sudden solutions start to emerge, even though they were convinced that no solutions existed. I love it when that happens. It's really powerful. And that also links into how we approach change, because change takes us outside what's familiar, places extra demands on our resources. And if we feel that those resources are already stretched, we're more likely to resist it. Now, from an organisational point of view, having spent most of my career leading change, that means it gets hard, because you've got to do an awful lot more work in selling the change, in managing the behaviours to make sure that people are adopting it. And also at the moment, when so much of the change that we're experiencing is being imposed from the outside, it makes our organisations less flexible and less responsive. It's also very common when we're feeling stretched or overloaded. Again, it takes resources to be able to step outside of yourself and look at a situation from different points of view. It takes time and it takes creative thinking. So what tends to happen as people get more stretched and overloaded is that goes out the window, and small differences of opinion are much more likely to fester or to escalate into conflict rather than them being resolved at source. And the effect that overpins all of them is the quality of our sleep. Sleep is one of the body's most powerful ways of replenishing those inner resources. So it's really unfortunate that just when we need it to be working at its absolute best, when we really need those resources, is just when it's least likely to be. I don't know if you've ever experienced one of those worries that in daylight feels about this big, but by the middle of the night, it expands and it's this big, and there is no way it's letting you get back to sleep. And one of the first effects that a lot of people notice when they've got some of those basic skills for taking the system off high alert is the quality of sleep improves, which then starts to feed a much more positive cycle with reducing all of those other effects that we've talked about. Now, of course, you can carry on just managing each effect. But it ends up a bit like that, the focus on that guy's face. So a mistake gets made and you fix it, and a bit of a conflict happens and you have to go back and sort it out, and this happens. And do you really want to carry on managing each of those individual effects as they surface? Or would you rather take apart the mechanism with the right well-being provision so that less of them pop up in the first place? Now, the other drawback to managing, it's got a few, as well as being quite tiring, is to illustrate. You might be wondering why the fresh fruit and veg. How many of the people you know eat their 5 fresh fruit and veg every single day? Probably not that many. We all know we should. We all understand why it's good for us. But we are rubbish at doing what's good for us consistently, particularly when we're feeling stressed and stretched, and the appeal of fast food and sofa magnifies. And whatever approach you take to managing, it requires doing something differently and doing it consistently enough to maintain the results. As soon as you stop, the overload, the discomfort, the stress, the upset, the whatever it was, comes back again. And this is the biggest difference in the skills that I work with. They retrain the brain to do it differently by itself. So it doesn't rely on maintaining a difference in behavior to maintain the outcomes. It's all about getting more of your people's best, more of the time. And if that's something that you want to explore a little bit further, there's a resource which I can make available, and I'll put this URL in the chat as well. It's the Leader's Guide to How Not to Waste Your Money on Wellbeing. It introduces you to a step-by-step method for creating an effective wellbeing strategy. And if there's anything else that you want to know about, I will be in the Q&A at the end. Jonathan, back to you.
That's great. That's great. I'm just checking I haven't got my echo back, which I don't think I have. So thank you very much, Sue. And certainly made me think there, because there was a little one of those things that was keeping me awake last night. So I need to obviously take some time out to think about why that was. It's something that was very small that was certainly occupying my thoughts in the middle of the night. And I wrote down, taking the time to think about well-being is obviously very important, not just thinking about the effects. So thank you for that. I'm going to move on now and introduce our second speaker, who's Craig Speed. Craig is the MD of Empro Group, and Craig, thanks again to you for joining us today. Empro Group focuses on a range of railway projects, particularly in the FM space and in train presentation, etc. But Craig's going to talk today about one particular suite of products they've developed called TouchSafe, which really focus around protective solutions for the workplace. So Craig, thanks for taking part, and over to you.
Thanks very much, Jonathan, and thanks for a great opening presentation, Sue. Yeah, so I'm going to go through some of the practical elements, certainly that we've embarked upon as a business at the start of the pandemic, and some of the things that our customers have asked. So unfortunately, we rely on Stuart to help me through the presentation. So if you can go to the first slide, please, Stuart, on the next one. Thank you. So just a bit about us as a business. We started in 2017, so we're quite a new entrant really into obviously a large marketplace, but we provide some complementary services in the rail sector predominantly, around training presentation, the installation of new technology and provision of sort of project managed services. And really at the start of the pandemic, we've seen significant growth through some of these, you know, the adaptation to the situation, if you like. And I'll talk a little bit about that and some of the things that we've done, but really the aim of this presentation is just to show you some of the practical examples, and we'll move on to that now. So if we have a look at the next. So really, why did we implement and go down the road that we have done in terms of trying to assist some of our customers with a sort of COVID secure workplace? Now we're dealing with the likes of TfL, London Underground, and right on the outset we was under the skin and experiencing some of the problems they were, and obviously we're in heavily unionised environments, and they were needing to engage with a lot of these members of staff, and we were really asked, is there anything you can do? Can you help us? And a lot of the challenges they were faced were really quite simple. You know, how to open doors, managing high touch point areas with an awful lot of staff that needed the confidence to know that they were in a safe environment still. And these were very much in the early days last year. So it was a voyage of discovery really for all of us in terms of what technology existed and what we could do to help support them. And there was a sort of contract cleaning company. We had to respond to the needs of our clients. So the sort of things we were doing was helping the freight industry, for instance, who are you know, managing critical supplies, PPE, food, all those other things that are happening behind the scenes. And quite early on, they figured that if drivers, their own critical resources start falling down within contained environments like locomotive cabs and the like, then they really could have a problem on their hands. So we were asked to support them with helping with their cleaning regimes and some of the technology that exists around antiviral fogging and things like that, which we'll talk about in a minute. So we were in the right place at the right time in terms of helping some of these people with their problems, and that was something that we had to react to. So the next question was, what was available, what was out there, and what could we pull from other industries and what may have been in practice previous to this in the medicine, you know, veterinary environments and food hygiene as well. But also we did look at some of the things that we could do internally as well to support ourselves and our own key workers that were going out in these environments. So in terms of the next slide, please, Stuart, in terms of some of the things that the innovation that was out there that we stumbled upon, what you can see there are some of the things that we utilize. So just to give you a bit of a kind of run through on those. See, while a lot of these were intended for internal use, we obviously wanted to apply them out into the market as well. And we found that an awful lot did exist. So as you can see in the top left, we talk about fogging, and that's a large bulk of what we do because we're in the game of supplying resource to sites and helping with operations. A lot of what we do now is supporting, as I say, the freight operators, but also some mainline operators with the stations and doing emergency COVID cleaning where there's been an outbreak. And we use technology which is antiviral chemicals that through the deployment through the right technology. So we use electrostatic guns that when we fire this medium out, it actually sticks to the surfaces and provides a barrier. And that can provide a barrier for up to 28 days. And so we can manage our cleaning regimes around that. It gives us a little bit of breathing space and protection in the interim while we're going and managing quite large areas. In the case of some of these freight operators, it's nationwide. So that's something we're doing an awful lot of, which is quite commonplace. But some of the infrastructure changes, quite interestingly, you'll see quite a lot of UV sanitization there. So the use of ultraviolet is nothing new. That's been used in water sterilisation and other things for a long time. And interestingly, where we look at some of those escalator handrail sanitizers, they've existed in places where SARS outbreak has preceded us for quite some time. So a lot of countries actually have adopted them a while ago, but they're a fixture that will go on an escalator, and they will keep that handrail clean with a UV bulb, which is self-generating, the power on that. And obviously we want people to be touching handrails on escalators for safety reasons. So that's something that I believe some of our underground networks are looking at deploying, as well as airports, etc. UV again can be used in HVAC filtration. We know that this virus is airborne, and there's a lot of talk about how we can maintain work environments, cleanliness, and also the air quality. So something that's really evolving now is the integration of retrofit UV tubes within HVAC systems, and that could be on public transport as well as offices and communal areas as well. And again, UV light is used in things like ambulances as turnaround cleaning with mobile wands and things like that. So there's a lot of application there. In addition to that, the other two, apart from the conventional that we see widespread around social distancing signage and screen dividers, etc., is the evolution of antimicrobial vinyls, sort of stickers really is what they are, with a protective surface on which uses silver ion technology, and they're not only self-cleaning, but they won't allow the pathogens to exist. They break them down as soon as they land. So they're being used on door opening, push plates on doors, door handles, all sorts of application there for large offices, and we're talking to quite a few big organisations about that. Very cost effective, and they last for sort of 5 years or so, and internally at least. And the added benefit is it can help with your cleaning regimes, because if you do nothing else but wipe over where those stickers exist, because they're high touch point areas, then it gives your cleaners a bit of focus on where they need to concentrate while we're managing the situation. And then two others finally is mechanical door opening devices. So you can see the hands-free door opener that's actually a foot pull, and we rolled these out an organisation, and they're very effective in restrooms. And actually, it's a good idea, irrespective of the pandemic. It's quite a hygienic way of opening that last door and making sure that you're not touching anything else that somebody might not have been as responsible in cleaning themselves. So that's another very, very sort of easy, effective method. And then the last one is hands-free proximity sensors. So we're working with a company to develop an existing product. Obviously, it's been used for a number of years for disabled doors and access, and this is a fairly simple retrofit mod that can go in place of an existing door push button. So that's something that we're looking at, and everyone, industries in general as well. So there's a kind of overview of some of the solutions that we've employed and that are available in the marketplace as well. Thanks, Stuart. Yeah, if we can go to the next one, please. So just some other ones in the round. Some of these we're doing that might not require any investment in equipment, but just good practice. And some of these we've employed as a business, but we try and obviously balance the flow of people, the capacity. So split shift working is something that's quite widespread now, or as people will migrate back into the workplace, that's something that can be employed. Reducing the workspace density as well, so the proximity of desk space and breakout areas and the review of floor plans and all that good stuff. It's not always possible, obviously, but if you've got the space, that's something else. And then there are applications and software being developed to assist with workspace scheduling and the managing of hot desking and all those sorts of things, and just to try and add technology into that. And then finally, temperature monitoring is something that has been employed. Some of our staff are subjected to that when they're going out onto some of these sites, and also tracing of contacts showing these symptoms. But interestingly, with the temperature monitoring, quite a lot of existing CCTV infrastructure actually does have that capability to switch on a module that monitors temperature as well. So that's something that's worth exploring if you've got those systems within your workplace. So to conclude then, really, just a bit of a summary and some of the practical steps and things that you can do when evaluating some of the improvements you can make practically within your workplace. So I think the first thing we'd encourage you to do is stop and evaluate. So really try and understand the solutions that are available and what might work for you. Obviously, we've touched on a few here, but there's an awful lot of things now coming out to the fore of what you can implement, and there's a lot of people that will be happy to engage and advise you on what you can do, and then include that within the risk assessments, which can be so much more than a tick box exercise, obviously, and then your employees will be keen to see that. Every incremental improvement will make a difference, so that needs to be considered. Seek practical solutions that meet your budget and environmental requirements. So not all businesses are going to be able to throw the kitchen sink at this, or they might not need to. So, home working is going to be a thing, we know that, but depending on your appetite to get back into the workplace, then you might just want to pick a few practical solutions that work for you. Would say to start doing things. So start to implement solutions to ensure that your workplace is as safe as practical. I think that it's too late once your staff are in there and they're feeling that the environment isn't safe. If you've got to that stage, you haven't prepared properly. So I think educating your teams as well to understand what solutions are available and really get that business improvement team to work, should I say, and try and understand what might work for you and what your employees would be keen to see and could adopt for the long term. And obviously budgets need to be considered as well in these difficult times. And then really continue to communicate with your employees on what the future workplace may look like. Engage with your trade unions if you're in a heavily unionized environment. Start those conversations early. You don't want surprises, and you want to be talking to them about what practical measures you need to take and what they're going to adopt and buy into as well. And again, research best practice and it's the continuous improvement element to it. Keep going back to the start and understanding where you are and what improvements you need to make. And I think I'll just end up on a bit of an analogy, really. And if we look at car safety, so in 1968, new vehicles were mandated to have seatbelts fitted, and really that's where we stayed for 20 or so years, and it wasn't until the sort of late 80s that a lot of the other measures came in place: airbags, ABS, side crumple zones, and all those things rolled out to the position where we are now, which is a very safe automotive environment, and the products that we can buy that we probably take for granted. So I think we're starting on this journey now, and I think there is a continuous improvement element to it, and I think we will see more and more solutions widespread in the workplace as we navigate through what works for us. So yeah, I'd like to leave you with that, and if there's anything, the contact details are obviously on the on this slide that will go out if you'd like to talk to us about any of our solutions, and I'd be really happy to take any questions as well at the end. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Craig, and very interesting. Really interesting to see how many of the products that you've been able to introduce have been already in use in other industries, and how that there's technologies available, widely available, that perhaps we haven't all yet rolled out across most working areas. So there's obviously, as you say, an element of continuous improvement there. And obviously a key point you mentioned there, I thought, was about the whole how you give confidence to the workforce by engaging them in that continual process of understanding what works for them and how to use these products more effectively. That's really interesting. Thank you very much. And again, can I just remind you all, obviously, if you have got any questions for Craig or Sue or for David, please do put those questions on the Q&A, as we'll have some time at the end of the session to go through those. So just turning now to our third speaker, David Evans. David is a Journey 4 associate, but also a very experienced coach and consultant. And David has worked in organisational change for many years and executive coaching, and he's also a very seasoned Aston Villa fan. So David, welcome, and thank you for taking your time to join us today. David's going to talk about mental well-being, and particularly about the leader's responsibility and leader's role in that.
Okay, thank you, Jonathan. Can you see the presentation? I hope so. So yeah, thanks to Sue and to Craig. Really interesting introduction and conversation about well-being. And what I'm going to be talking about is the fact that finding a balance between the time we spend at work and elsewhere is a critical part of maintaining good mental well-being. So I'm going to be talking about the workplace conditions and culture as foundations of achieving good work-home life balance, and the associated responsibilities of leaders to achieve this. And I'd like to just start with this quote, which I think really summarizes the philosophy of a well-being-led leadership. It talks about the higher purpose that leaders have to create the conditions in which people can do what they do best every day. And it's very much focused on individual identities being recognized, expressed, and enhanced. So I think it really encapsulates really well this whole philosophy of well-being as it relates to leadership. And really, it's all about the culture. And we've probably heard that many times before. And culture can, for some people, seem rather woolly and fluffy. But there's a massive amount of tangibility about culture, which I'll explain as we go through this. As I said a minute ago, for me, leadership is about enabling people to do what they do best every day. And it's also about recognizing the fact that it's real people doing real things, and they all have real lives to go back to when they've been at work. I use an example. I worked for an organization, an engineering organization, a large engineering organization, that wherein when I talk to managers about what their roles and responsibilities were, quite often, in fact, many of them would suggest that their real focus when they talked about assets was the tangible assets that they were responsible for. And they didn't see the people as part of their asset responsibility, even though for many of them they had senior roles in with many people working for them. I always found that slightly strange. Also, the culture is also about creating space and time for people to take respite. And importantly, in my opinion, it's about taking a positive psychology approach, which means focusing on strengths, playing people to their strengths, allowing them to do what they do best every day. And also developing practical workplace and workday strategies. And what I mean by that is a particular reference to the fact that there are many employees, in fact, a majority of employees in the workplace in the UK, who are carers in some way for children, elderly parents, other relatives, and therefore having strategies that support them in the form of things like flexible work hours, midday departure times, perhaps to meet family needs, offering home care services as an employee health benefit, perhaps being able to provide on-site services like meal preps, dry cleaning, pharmaceutical services to reduce the hassle for employees who have many errands to run on behalf of the people they might care for. So the way that we understand the culture and the way that we execute and make that culture come to be is massively important. It enables us to move from here to here. And without wishing to pick up a political slogan, it's about yes, we can, as well as yes, I can. So I make the link between engagement, personal engagement at work, and well-being. So in my opinion, the first step in understanding how to create a well-being led culture is the development of engagement. Because if people are not engaged in what they do at work, every hour they spend there will be pure drudgery for them. And I see personal engagement in three facets. One is psychological meaningfulness, where it's about fitting people to the right jobs to suit their skills, and allowing them to be able to do fulfilling work and operate well with their co-workers. Psychological availability is about basically having the headspace for work, being able to deal with all of the challenges at work whilst also managing the outside distractions that we have, the other things that are going on in our lives, the sense of security at work and not feeling under pressure that the job might at some point disappear. So psychological availability. And then the third one is psychological safety, where people are able to feel that they can articulate what they really feel and mean, and that without the sense of either being disrespected or disregarded in any way. So having great relations with co-workers and line manager and being able to say what we really mean and really feel is really important. And if we generate that sense of engagement at work, and what we can then do is to make that link with well-being. And the definitions that are now on the screen really are about understanding that if we can achieve employee engagement, we can get well-being going. Because if people are engaged, they can put into much easier perspective the issues that might generate stress, dissatisfaction, and angst. Sue referred to this before about getting the balance between resources and load, and that really makes sense. If we feel good at work, then we can actually deal with stuff in a much more effective way. Last October, I did some work with a public sector business unit that really focuses on well-being and work-home life balance as a fundamental part of their culture. Remember, this work was done in the time of COVID, so we'd reasonably expect issues of work-home life balance and well-being to be very much to the fore. And what we did, we asked around 350 people to describe what being at work is like at the moment. What is their experience of work? What is the current culture? And in general terms, the responses were very positive. And the organisation that I was working for had obviously done a lot of work to develop good employee recognition and well-being, particularly, and a place where people feel they can make a difference. But there was also a significant number of responses where there's some sort of negative things going on around hierarchy and bureaucracy, particularly in silo mentality. And in fact, about 28% of the responses that we got focused on stuff that was less positive, and which as a result was causing, let's say, a drag on the business. The business wasn't operating as effectively as it could do. And we then asked them what the future would look like if they were working at their highest potential. And the sort of desired values that people were talking about in that answering that question talked about accountability and continuous improvement, and around collaboration and leadership role modeling. So they weren't saying that the current culture was bad. They were saying that the current culture could be enhanced in ways that would enable the business to perform at a much higher level. And so we were able to work with the management team to develop an action plan that really focused on particularly visible and dynamic leadership, about openness and accountability, and more collaborative partnering. Really focusing much more, or even more, on the people the processes and the structure of the business. And they're now in the process of executing these action plans to ensure that people work more effectively. And of course, COVID has really sort of magnified the whole issue. In fact, the organisation that I used, or the business I used to support this organisation, the Barratt Values Centre, recently conducted a survey around the impact of COVID-19 on the values that people focused on at work. And in their survey of around 2,500 people, what they found very, very clearly was that there was a real demand now for homework balance, people focus, working more together, working better together, and greater sense of adaptability. So some interesting thoughts from the Barratt Values Centre. So if I list the sorts of things that leaders can really focus on in terms of creating good work-home life balance, I'd be looking at a list something like this, and I'm not going to go through all of the list that's revealing now, but what I would say is it's very individualistic, real focus on the individual. It's quite intensive. If a leader is going to carry out all of these ways of working, it is pretty intensive, and there are probably going to be trade-offs and compromises to be made. But as a leader, we want to ensure that people can do what they do best every day. That's really the bottom line. And being a role model, particularly checking in with people on a regular basis and conducting regular values-based culture checks are really important. How do we know how well we're doing? I mean, we have obviously the hard metrics of absenteeism, sickness, high people turnover, but there's also some behavioural steers that we can be looking out for in the workplace on a day-to-day basis, where we can observe how people are working together and whether there's a good sense of collegiate working and collaboration. And some of these things, some of these factors, some of these behavioural indicators would really help us. So back to the quote from Moss Cantor that I showed at the beginning. I think that's a really useful steer in terms of how we can live our lives as leaders in businesses. So as a final point, what I'd say is that above all else, when people are not in a great place, the best thing they can hear is, I'm listening and I'm responding in support of your best interests. And I'd be happy to take any questions that you might have. And Jonathan, back to you.
Great, thank you very much, David. And that's really interesting that obviously that you talk about culture there. I think culture and engagement particularly, and how it's the role obviously of the leaders to focus on creating the right culture and engaging employees to get to that point, which I suspect in the current focus on short-term priorities, people perhaps aren't thinking too much about culture, but ultimately, you know, that's where it really rests, isn't it?
Absolutely, yes.
For your time. So we've got sort of 5 or 10 minutes left. We are due to finish at 20 past, so we'll just have 5 minutes of questions. But if there are people on the call who want to stay on beyond that, there are a couple of the questions we can ask. But just by starting that questioning off, so if I can come to you first. Just very interesting, obviously, how you were talking about well-being strategies. And as you're talking to businesses yourself, do you think there's become a greater awareness of well-being, and particularly having a well-being strategy in place where the leaders are more likely now to consider that to be important?
I think the awareness of well-being as a whole is definitely improving radically. Strategy is lagging somewhat behind that. One of the test points I always use is when I'm talking with organisations who have got activities underway, ask them why they chose those particular activities. And very often there isn't an answer, which is a clear indicator that it's not part of a strategy. The trouble is that ends up with a yo-yoing effect. So an activity will be launched, there'll be loads of energy, there'll be loads of excitement, or there's an awareness event, and then in between it disappears without trace. For wellbeing to really deliver what it's capable of, it needs to not only have a strategy, but have that strategy be integrated with the organisation's whole strategy, which is, you know, why I talk about all those different effects. It's not just about how people feel and whether they're well, it's how they perform.
Yes, absolutely. So there's an awareness of well-being, but not translating it into leaders taking action on focusing on.
No, I mean, there are some trailblazer organisations who are doing amazing things, but they're in the very small minority so far.
Yes. Hopefully that will change in time, and hopefully employees will drive that themselves by their own feedback. So, Craig, if I can come to you, obviously you've talked about lots of different processes and protocols that are being put in place during this period. To what degree do you think some of these new procedures, particularly safety and environmental procedures, will be and should be maintained post-COVID?
Yeah, I mean, regulation and kind of, we need those sort of boundaries, I think, that maybe encourage a minimum level requirement. And obviously the HSE have set out guidelines, but there are industries where this isn't anything new. You know, the food safety and the ratings, you know, even in restaurants and kitchens, but also, you know, medicine, you know, the NHS environment and veterinary practice and things like that. They all have to abide by, you know, regular audits and practices. And some of these, we touched on some of the antimicrobial vinyls, that they've been in existence for quite some time, and their original intention was to just improve attendance around, you know, flu and the common cold, and you know, we know the statistics around the amount of people who lost days, even prior to the situation we find ourselves in now. So for a long time, there's been things that we could do to improve the environment in which we work in, but obviously there hasn't been that driving need. So I think coupled with some form of minimum standard, I think that will probably drive us to where we need to start going.
It was really interesting, the example you gave of the car industry and how much that's become now the norm, hasn't it? All the safety features that we would take for granted that weren't only sort of 40, 50 years ago. So you think this could potentially provide a trigger for a step change in safety and well-being in organisations?
Absolutely. You know, we take it for granted now, don't we, putting a seatbelt on? But I think most of us, we can remember a time when that wasn't the case. And yeah, how that's evolved to the position we're in now, you know, it's human nature, isn't it? We need to improve our safe existence on this planet, and this is here to stay, unfortunately, and our resilience long term is going to need solutions beyond perhaps what we see in front of us. There might need to be some sub levels of things that just become part of the infrastructure, perhaps. Attachments on escalator, handrails, we might not be blinking at in 10 years time, you know. I think that's the sort of openness and solution sort of mindset we need to have.
Yeah, great, thanks, Craig. And David, just turn to your question for you. You talked about, obviously, ultimately it's all about culture. Do you think organisation culture will change post-COVID generally?
I think it probably will do. I mean, as I said, the Barratt Valley Centre did a survey middle of last year, May, I think it was, where they identified a significant shift in people's values and approach towards work, towards greater home work-life balance, people focus, greater sense of working together and collaboration, and, you know, helping each other in a way that perhaps wasn't evident previously, and a greater sense of adaptability. And it's interesting, Ian's asked the question about, do we see the COVID-driven working from home phenomenon as a mini industrial revolution? And I think it probably will be, and I hope it is, in a sense, because I think we need fewer cars on the road, and you know, that what we've seen is we can work very, very flexibly. I wouldn't necessarily want to be working at home the whole time, but having the opportunity to work at home more often and spend less time traveling to work, I think it's been massively important. And certainly the work I referenced in my short presentation there about the the business unit I worked for in October. I think one of the overarching conversations I had with people in focus groups as part of that work was how much more efficient they've been working from home, that they've been able to combine working from home with better health regimes, obviously the lack of travelling to and from work, was massively important for people. And yes, equally, there were some people who found it claustrophobic to be at home all the time, were struggling to balance off kids homeschooling and the challenges of working in an environment where your partner perhaps is also trying to work from home. So yeah, I mean, clearly there are downsides, but I think there's a massive opportunity for a shift in culture.
Yeah, thank you, David. And thank you for tying in that question from the end, because I wanted to end upon that question and just open that out to Sue and Craig as well. Sue, just to ask you first, to what degree do you think the changes in working from home will become partly normal in the post-COVID era, or do you think we'll go back to over time back to how things used to be?
I think we'll end up in a hybrid. I mean, what it has done is proved the supposedly impossible possible. There are so many organisations that genuinely believe there's no way their people could work from home and have been royally proved wrong. And a lot of people want to have the choice. Again, I don't think any of us would want to be solely home-based unless there's a particular reason for it. But I don't think we'll ever go back to the 9 to 5 on-site, everybody in the office kind of model that we had before, which is a good thing.
Yeah, I agree. Craig, anything you want to add on that point yourself?
No, I agree with what Sue just said. I think we just need to be selective about the things we hold dear and the things we do want to design for our future, and not try and sort of limit some of those things that we have taken for granted, the social element. And you know, a lot of business is about human interaction and building rapport and all the rest of it. And yeah, I just think we need to be a watchful eye around that isolation element and some of the social side of life that is so important to us being human.
I agree, yes. I've enjoyed working at home. I've missed that social interaction. I'm sure we all have. And I'm looking forward to seeing some of you beneath the shoulders in the future.
Yeah.
On that note, so just want to obviously thank all our attendees for attending and staying through the duration of the call. We slightly overrun, but the Q&A was useful as well. And obviously, finally, I want to thank again Sue, David, and Craig for taking the time to share your thoughts with us. As Stuart mentioned at the outset, we are going to share the presentations online, and we'll have a recording of this webinar as well, which will be made available online on our website and through LinkedIn. So thanks to David and Craig. Thank you to all for listening, and I hope you'll join us for our 4th webinar next month. Thanks again.